Hello, my name is Laura. I'm a student in Professor Ennis's Art World After 1989 class, and I will be introducing the panelists for the Immigration and Imagination panel. So the first panelist is Michele Carlson, who is an associate professor in visual and critical studies at the California College of the Arts and the executive director of Daily Serving and Art Practical. Carlson is one of the third of the arts collective Related Tactics, which entertains diverse projects at the intersection of race, art, and culture. Michele Dizon is an artist, filmmaker, writer, theorist, and educator based in Los Angeles. She's the founder of At Land's Edge, an experimental platform for visual research and catalyst for the decolonial thought and action. She earned an MFA in art at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a PhD in rhetoric from the University of California, Berkeley. Kate Hers-Ree's interdisciplinary work reflects the complex nature of miscast identity, cultural dislocation, and gendered interactions. She works in Germany, the United States, and South Korea, and established her studio in Berlin in 2009. The panel is moderated by Việt Lê, who is an artist, writer, and curator whose work focuses on trauma, modernity, and popular cultures in Southeast Asian diasporas. He is an assistant professor in visual studies at the California College of the Arts. His art and research has been featured at H Gallery Bangkok, in the Shanghai Biennial, and the Smithsonian. Please welcome them to the Immigration and Imagination panel.
Hi, thanks for being here. Thanks, Kiara and Jen and Pitzer for hosting us, and of course, the panelists. Just gonna say some quick opening intros and then close. Just thinking about framing in conversation with Manifesto, thinking through the two modes as the panel title suggests: immigration, thinking about this moment historically of migration, and also this role of the imagination, but in thinking through imagination, not necessarily as a celebratory mode, but then also the imagination as a place in which racialized violence and structural oppressions get manifest to the real. One of our panelists, Carlos Jackson, couldn't make it today due to an emergency, but we'll also go in terms of alphabetical order by last name, so you can see their bios more fully in the booklet. So first off, Michele Carlson.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here on a beautiful Friday. I just flew in from the Bay Area, which is not so beautiful right now, so it's raining. So I am an artist and a writer and a curator, and I thought that today I would actually read from the kind of book project that I've been working on called The Visits. And The Visits is a collection of essays that kind of span the scope of poetry and prose and critical analysis and kind of more formal essays that are set against the backdrop of visiting my younger brother in prison over the course of 7.5 years in about 6 different Washington State facilities. And I'm looking and kind of interested specifically in, you know, the kind of relationship between or the kind of relationships of kinship and family building, especially family building that is institutionalized. So I look a lot at what it means to build family within the space of incarceration, but also thinking about my own transnational adoption and thinking about the kind of institutionalization of what becomes a very kind of troubling and complex family unit. And so I am going to read this kind of prologue, for lack of a better word for it yet, of the book, which is probably one of the more kind of prose-based, poetic-based pieces. And I pull a lot from my own adoption papers and documents. Very little information came with me from Korea, where I was adopted from. So I use those and then kind of speak to my brother in this text, and thinking a lot about the kind of contextualization for this work for myself. And this piece actually kind of came from working with another writer who asked me a very straightforward question one night, which was, why do you visit your brother? And it's like, it was a question that I actually couldn't answer because it just seemed so like he's my brother. Obviously, I would visit him. But she really pushed me to consider a deeper, kind of more complicated purpose for visiting him, which I visited him about 67 times over the course of 7.5 years. One of the things about this piece too, like it looks a lot like this. So there's a lot of, it's like redaction poetry. So it's kind of weird because it really is like a visual thing, but I'm gonna read it to you. So just hang in there with me. Background information 1, case number 81-20/KSY. According to the information from the police station, the child was found on the road, located in Gocheokdong, Goryeo-gu, Seoul, around 6:30 a.m. on January 9th, 1981. At that time, she had a piece of paper saying her birth date, August 13th, 1980. Her name was given by our worker, meaning that Ki was prosperous, Soon gentle, and Yang surname. This story doesn't begin in prison, though I have been to prison 67 times. It begins with a woman none of us know and 2 kids in the system, Seoul in winter. On my laptop screen, a thick comforter of snow elegantly levels the mismatched rough edges of the city where white dusts brown tiled rooftops and the silence of winter trims stoic temples. Looks goddamn cold, at least according to my Google image search of January in Seoul, Korea. I scroll through hundreds of photos on my computer. They become one big blur, a digital whiteout. Scroll, scan, search. Babe, I love you so. I want you to know. I love you so. I'm gonna miss your love the minute you walk out that door. Please don't go. Don't go. Casey's falsetto pleads into my earbuds, so I click on the YouTube video that peeks from behind my search window for What Happened in 1980 and see an emotional Harry Wayne Casey, eyes closed, fists clenched, starched white collars violently pierce the air. This must be what they mean by from the soul, blue-eyed soul. Please don't go. I search, online only, refreshing searches for the date or place I was abandoned on a road in January when I was 6 months old at 6:30 a.m. and goddamn cold, I imagine. Even 5 years ago, the internet couldn't find search results for Gocheokdong, Goryeo-gu, Seoul, where I was found. For 25 years, I thought this was an intersection and would try to find the street or avenue or drive, but it's actually an administrative neighborhood within a district, not 2 specific streets. Today, Google can correct the correct the romanization to Gocheokdong, Goryeo-gu. My lazy American tongue can barely make out the difference. The more detailed the internet becomes, the more I disappear. Don't go. I search only when I'm anxious and too bored, in traffic, in line at the bank, waiting for a friend at a bar. My fingers follow instinct, scroll, scan, search. It is an orphan's placebo. I zoom into this neighborhood, lurching through the pixelated streets cobbled together by algorithms where someone had cared enough about me to leave me. My body and my parentage were forsaken, and their parenthood was cleansed. Goddamn cold. I'm gonna miss your love the minute you walk out that door. Don't go. Background information 2. The foster family by whom the child is well cared for at present consists of 6 family members. Foster mother, aged 42, who is a housewife, her husband, aged 48, who is a merchant, and their 2 sons and 2 daughters who are all students. They're all healthy and live in an apartment house now. The foster mother is active and takes good care of the child. This story also begins in 1996 when my divorced mom married your single dad, 2 only children with the same parents. You in Florida would fly to us in Seattle several times a year, rotating holidays, 6 weeks in the summer, every other spring break. In divorce, there's no such thing as going Dutch. Divorced parents always fork out because loss is the soul of divorced parenting. No one stays. Most of my white friends growing up had divorced parents. They showed off their new kicks, clothes, phones, cash, even cars. One parent bought because they were convinced the other wasn't stepping up. No one could afford it, though. The careful and complex symphonies orchestrated by divorced kids. Goddamn cold. Parents and the child are cleansed with this love. We would pick you up from the airport and go straight to the mall. If we bought you enough stuff, maybe you wouldn't go. Don't go. Background information 3, 0 to 6 months, nothing. 6 months to 1 year and 3 days, foster family. I hope she will join a good adoptive family soon. This story also begins in 2008 when my brother was arrested in Seattle. He and some friends broke into 3 separate drug dealers' houses and stole all their shit. I just wanted the E and cologne, he explains years later. He was 19, sorry. I didn't care about the money. He just wanted the stuff. We didn't shoot anyone. The gun never went off. B pistol whipped this dude. He told me to do it, but I ain't pistol whipping no dude. Have you ever heard that before? I didn't see him do it. I heard it crack his head. I ain't pistol whipping no dude. He said to me through the grimy phone receiver and smudged thick protective glass between us during our first visit when he was still in county. B was like, come over here and hit him too, Red. But I was like, nah, I ain't hitting no dude. They're saying 10 to 15 years, choking on his last words. The tears poured down his face, smearing the hundreds of freckles that mark him. The punishment doesn't fit the crime, the judge remarked at his sentencing when he ruled Adam's 7.5-year sentence. A young man from a good family, no record, and some college shouldn't be in prison this long, but a gun was present. Mandatory gun sentencing requires me to tack on 5 years that cannot be touched for early release. He served 7.5 years, hard time at 19. I hope she will find a good adoptive family soon. My mom, your dad, my stepdad, and I long for you to live with us in Seattle, when you still played t-ball and softball and went to summer camp. And finally, at 18, your mom kicked you out of the damp Florida air that weighs heavily day into night and sent you to live with your dad and his other family in the goddamn cold, gray wetness of Seattle, finally. But this was after you had crashed your grandfather's car into a canal, or arrested for dipping into your own stash before you passed out in class, got kicked out of 2 high schools, came home drunk and peed all over your bedroom, and other things the rest of us can cleanse ourselves of blame for because, well, boys sometimes do that. So you came to live with your dad, and your mom was cleansed. As a welcome, I printed about 50 no pee zone signs and taped them all over your room. In our family, our love is rough. Your dad laughed nervously when you saw the signs. His ceaseless torment is that we might push you away for good because our love is too hard. He doesn't understand that for kids like us, love that is hard is safer than being too soft. You were still 110 pounds then, skinny, scrawny, and your bright red hair was bleached from years in the oppressive Florida sun. You stood stark against Seattle's gray backdrop. Your body had yet to shapeshift into its new home. When you got here, we clung desperately to the legible markers of success, spinning narratives of middle-class well-being as if they proved to everyone, to ourselves, that everything was cool, that your trouble was normal because middle-class normal is life. It's a big transition, but he's enrolled in college, or it's not easy, but we're looking forward to Thanksgiving with the family, or he's making so many new friends. This alleviated the heaviness of our darkness, the looming storm we could feel but not see. We were all animals sensing a coming trouble that we could not articulate any other way but to run with our entire might towards decorum. 8 months with us before you were sent to prison, and we were all cleansed. Workers' comments 4. She's a cute child. I hope she will join a good adoptive family soon and grow under much love. This story also begins in 1979 when my adoptive parents, a young couple married at 24 and 23, college lovebirds, that discovered they couldn't have kids once they changed their mind about wanting them. It's not for a lack of trying, 2 years to be exact, but not every life is the same success story. They are not original. Like hundreds of thousands of other white couples, they adopted a baby from Korea. It was the safe adoption. It took about 9 months and cost $5,000. They borrowed half from his parents, who happily laid out the loan with interest. I was on a plane with 12 other babies who were also being adopted into good families, whose stories were not yet successes. I hope we cleansed them all. You look just like me, my mom always says. You are my daughter. She was cleansed. I've been to prison 67 times. Every time I handed you back to the institution where you could not escape, could not be saved, and where none of us are safe. We are two kids from the cleansing of parentage onto ourselves. We are of the system that does not care that each of us might bleed in our own way, or that some of us think we bleed better because we do so in single-family homes with manicured hedges from good families. This story may be only for you and me. It is about how we saved each other and pulled each other from the cracks in a system that is as much our oppressor as it is of our own making. It is how I visited you across thousands of miles, plane rides, car trips, and pat-downs, so you would not spin so far into the cracks that you might fill them. This story is because the first time I met you when you were 9 and I was 17, you pulled me in from the goddamn cold, 2 single children from the same parents. Babe, I love you so, I want you to know, I love you so, please don't go. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Michele, for what was an incredible piece of writing. You just blew me away. The title for my talk today is Archival Futurisms, Memory and the Ruins of Imperialism. And during this presentation, I'll be sharing an excerpt of a work in progress that's called The Archives Fold. It's going to be a multi-image slide and a sound installation that will premiere at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery on April 29th, and I think run through the end of June. But it is a work in progress, and I wanted to offer you just a little bit of a context before I share this excerpt with you. Give you some context for the questions that gave rise to the project and the frame around which the work takes place. So much of my work for the past 2 decades has been based in historical research. As a time-based media artist, my work is extremely research-driven. But it was a very personal desire that led me into the U.S. colonial archives, which is some of the main content of the images that I'm working with. These are U.S. colonial archives documenting the Philippines during the occupation. So I was led to the archives because I was really inspired by stories I've heard throughout my life about my great-great-grandmother, who was magical. Her name was Letipa, and you'll hear about some of her magic in the excerpt that I'll share with you. She lived during the turn of the 20th century, also during the turn of Philippines from Spanish to U.S. colonialism. And I was driven to the archive because I wanted to write her story. And I wanted to try to give some shape to what I felt like was a kind of magical resistance to the force of occupation. And I wanted to find some images of what the town that we're from, Cotabato City, might have looked like around that time. And I went to provincial archives where we're from. I went to the National Archives of the Philippines, didn't find anything. And that ultimately led me to DC, and in particular the National Archives, where so much of the documentation, in particular visual documentation of the Philippines during the U.S. colonial period sits. And what my entry into the U.S. Colonial Archive did was really throw into relief the politics of the archive itself and the way that the archive is inseparable from the violence of colonialism. This violence exists in the form of silence and erasure of all of those who have been condemned to death, dehumanization, stereotype, objectification, sexual violence, categorized and stripped of any possibility of being a human or being an agent of history. And these experiences in and with the archive made me ask what, if anything, can be recuperated from the colonial archive in the midst of so much violence. What can I listen for within the silences? What can I look for outside of the frame, and toward what end? So I understand archival futurism as a work with archives that is based in how colonial conditions of violence continue into the present, as a realm of intimacy between the dead, the living, and the still to be born, and as part of a larger work of liberation invested in developing the fullest understanding of the silenced and the disappeared, all the while grappling with the loss and limits to this knowing. The archives fold is organized as a correspondence between the dead and yet to be born, between my great-great-grandmother in 1905 and my great-great-great-granddaughter in 2123. And both of these figures are named Latipa. The future Latipa writes during a time when the earth has become uninhabitable. In an attempt to lower the earth's temperature, massive amounts of sulfuric gas have been thrown into the atmosphere to lower the earth's temperature, but it went too far in the other direction, and the sun was blocked and introduced an epoch of total darkness. And Latipa is on her way to Proxima b, which is 4.2 light years away, the closest planet to the Earth thought to be able to support life. So this is the backdrop, and if I could have the lights off, please, I'll move through the excerpt. March 22, 2123. Dear Amma, it is said that the earth was very beautiful. I learned about its elements while still in the core, one of the sanctuaries cut inside an active volcano for survivors of the total darkness. It was my grandmother, 6 generations after you, who fled to the core with nothing but her pregnant belly and her descriptions of the sun, the land, the trees, the food. It was she who taught me about the earth, and she who encouraged my mother to give me your name, Latipa. She told me about your ability to travel through space and time, stories she had heard from her mother and from her mother before her. She told me about how you would disappear for days and return dripping wet. When people would ask where you've been, you weren't afraid to tell them the truth. I've been to Mecca. She told me about how you walked through your town with the power of invisibility. She told me about how your husband had wanted to leave you and return to China. He boarded his boat, but you sent a massive storm his way, and he was forced to return to you. She told me about your decision to be buried apart from your husband, your commitment to be buried on your ancestral land. She told me about how all those who tended to your grave prospered. In my sleep, I have been given access to all the images of the world, and yet none of them make sense to me. There are no images that calm my mind. There are no images for me to live in. I was made to believe that my journey was through space, but instead, I understand that I am barreling, aimless, into the furthest reaches of time. Love, Latipa. March 23, 1905. Dearest Apo, I received your message in a dream. I saw you move through darkness toward an elsewhere that I cannot even begin to fathom. I never left my small town, and here you are, amongst the stars. Yours is a journey of light years. You tell me, a journey you must endure to have a chance at life. When you close your eyes, you see images of the great beauty and radiance of the earth, along with the immense destruction and sadness. You tell me that these images mean nothing to you. I understand. It was a naive scientist who thought that images alone were identical to memory. A naive scientist who didn't understand that the least important thing about an image is what it shows. It is said that the earth was very beautiful. Yes, it was beautiful, but also so very ugly. The words beautiful and ugly are useless. They can't capture what would one day drive you, Apo, into deep time. The conditions of your journey were already in formation during my time. I wonder now what I could have done to stop it. I cry for you, just as the day I cried when 5 generations before your grandmother left for America, and just as the day I shielded your grandmother from the harshness of the wind when she fled for the Corps. Apo, the images they have given you are a hall of mirrors. The archives you have access to are reflections of the same. They told you that these are all images of the world, but that is their distorted vision. The images are just pieces of tape, and on the other side are worlds so much more vast than anything their archives could ever possibly contain. The world was never made of images. You write to me because you know this. This knowledge lives in your blood, the same way it lived in my granddaughter's blood when she would mediate between the worlds of the living and the dead. The same way it lived in her granddaughter's blood when storytelling became a bridge between past, present, and future. My tears for you exist in the archive's folds. My tears send the image to its ruin. You are not looking for an image to live in, but for a memory that lives in your cells. It is memory that will sustain you in deep time. They want to imagine us dead. They are ignorant of the connection between the living and the dead. I am with you in this journey. Love, Ama. Thank you.
Those are two amazing presentations, very hard to follow. So I'm really excited to be here. I want to just say thank you again to Viet for the invitation, to Kira and to Chukwa for the organization and the curation of the exhibition. I am going to concentrate actually on, let me just go to the next slide. Okay, so my presentation is called The Chocolate Kiss and Other Stories. I'm going to concentrate pretty much on this project as well as a few projects that I did that are related to that work. And I think it's because I want to talk a little bit about imagination, immigration. I was thinking about that, negotiating my identity as a two-time immigrant, the first being from South Korea to the United States without my permission, without really my knowledge of becoming an immigrant. And then my second immigration to Germany, where I currently live in Berlin, which was of my choice, which I made that choice in 2009. And my repatriation back to South Korea, where I actually was able to recover my South Korean passport. And I'd actually really also like to have a German passport as well, because I'm very greedy like that. I'd like to have 3, but unfortunately I'm just able to be a resident. But I'm thinking a lot about that, especially in the rise of the alt-right in Europe and a lot of this like rise of xenophobia and the refugee crisis. So I thought it would be very appropriate for me to start off with an image first of my studio in Berlin and a quote that is very meaningful to me by the late, great Grace Lee Boggs, who's a philosopher, great thinker, author, and one of my mentors who I've known since I was in high school. And she says, quote, a revolution that is based on the people exercising their creativity in the midst of devastation is one of the greatest historical contributions of humankind, end quote. And I think for me, this is a very important sort of statement that I like to look at, especially when I'm having a hard time with my practice. I grew up in a very working class, racially segregated area in the suburbs of Detroit, where art making and thinking about art was not really part of my everyday life. And so it's taken me a really long time to find my voice and to find my artistic practice. So the project, the first piece that I want to talk about is based in a very personal experience that I had living in Berlin, deciding to move there. And this was a book that was published in 2010, the fall of 2010, called Deutschland schafft sich ab, which means Germany abolishes itself. It was published by Thilo Sarrazin, who was a very high-level politician from the Social Democratic Party. And he was also an executive with the, I guess the Federal Reserve is what it would be called in English. And this is really the point in which multiculturalism, the problems of it, the problem of integration, and the Muslim problem was really being discussed in the German society. So after this book was published, I started seeing a rise in hate crimes against people of color, not only against Muslims and Turks, but also against Blacks and Asians. And I experienced that firsthand as I was riding the S-Bahn train home from my studio. I was targeted, and I was threatened and chased by neo-Nazis. And so this real, violence that I experienced firsthand galvanized me into taking a political position in my work about multiculturalism. And before this, I was actually working on issues surrounding integration. So this is the first piece that I had done from 2008, in which I, tried to integrate myself into the German society by learning German in a period of 3 months, a language that I could not speak. This was an interactive, internet-based work, which I also could meet with people who would want to talk to me about how I could integrate my way into the German society. And so after the book came out, then I decided I need to make a work that is that can extend these ideas surrounding these questions that I was having about what does it mean to be German. And so I began the German-speaking project #2. And this was really kind of a research project into the etymology of different types of German words, specifically ones that were based in insults, that were specifically racist or sexist in origin. And then the next project, which is related to this, is where I'm going to actually talk about mostly, is the Chocolate Kiss Project, which was a natural development of the German-speaking project. And it began when I started noticing that there was a particular candy that, people like to refer to as an N-word kiss. And I would only hear this in very small parties, or friends would talk about it amongst themselves. And I was quite dumbfounded and perhaps a little naive, but I started actively confronting white Germans about their usage of this very racist and outdated term. And I was surprised to find that most people who I spoke to were shocked that I had even brought it up. They, in fact, didn't find that their usage was in any way racist, because their intention was not racist. And in fact, it was something that they had nostalgia for, that it was something that really reminded them of their childhood. And so then I began to think of this chocolate kiss, which is the actual name for this food product. It's a chocolate kiss or a Schaum kiss. I started seeing it as kind of being like a cultural artifact of German identity because Germans felt so attached to it. And as I dug deeper into the project, into the etymology of the word, I found that actually it used to be called the N-word kiss until the 1980s. And so I just couldn't imagine there being official packaging of, in shops in different markets in Germany. And so I started seeing it as this cultural artifact, and I started doing these very direct, very visceral experiments in my studio. And this is one of the sculptural projects that I did first, Blackface projection grid. And these are, in fact, corks that then I've manipulated in different ways. So the first one is just the raw cork on board. The second one is painted black. And the third one is burnt cork. And the third one is very meaningful because when blackface performers, they didn't actually use paint in the beginning to blacken their skin. They used burnt cork. And this was actually the first live performance that I did with this work. I wanted to make action drawings using these N-word kisses. And it's called 7 Drawings and 28 Kisses. And I performed this live for a German audience in Berlin. And the reason that there are 28 kisses in the piece, so 7 drawings and 28 kisses, I am evoking the little Gauss arithmetic progression formula. So it's, where you take, this is a great example, the integers from 1 to 100, and you would add them together and get that sum. And it was actually discovered by a German mathematician, which I was very interested in this idea of using German rational thought in the piece. The reason I was interested in using counting, I thought of it as being a metaphor for the ways in which we count the other. And instead of naming them as individuals, we just see them as a large mass. Okay, and the next piece I will show. This work is actually in the Manifesto show in the gallery, so I really would ask you to go and to see the entire video piece. I thought that I would rather spend my time, explaining and enlightening you about some of the reasons behind doing this work. It's a photographic and a performance video called "And Then There Were None," which is the last phrase of a British minstrel song, which is now called the 10 Little Indians, which is also very problematic. But you can see the two performers in the video. There's a Asian female who I performed, and then there was a black male. And I'll just, for those of you who haven't seen the video, I'll just represent a little bit. What happens is I'm sitting in the frame. The black male performer comes in. He turns me around, facing away from him. He puts on this S&M mask. He turns me around. And then he begins to take these chocolate kisses and put them in my mouth. And then he takes them from me. And how he takes them from me can be interpreted in many different ways. Sometimes it looks like he's a bit shy or intimidated. Other times he may look a bit aggressive or passionate. And his actions actually become more frenzied towards the end of the video. So there are 10, and if you watch it, you'll notice that, in fact, he only ends up eating the first one, and then in the second to the 10th, he spits them out quite violently. So I was interested in these very complex and absurd ways that bodies of color are, always being seen as these very sexualized beings, and it's always at this intersection between or at race and gender. And I'm also interested in giving a lot of visual anxiety in my work to the viewer, but I hope to also transport this idea of pleasurable discomfort, because I think a lot of my work is actually a lot about this idea of discomfort, but I like to use a lot of humor in the work as well. And so I wanted people, when they watched it, they felt maybe some guilty pleasure in watching this interaction between these two bodies. And I think I began to articulate this work after I made it as a way to be in dialogue with the controversy and the conflict between the African American and the Korean American communities, specifically within the Los Angeles area. And in that, I looked again at a text that was really important to me when I was a graduate student at the University of California, Irvine. A text and a theory that was coined by Claire J. Kim, who's a professor in the political science department, and she called it the theory of racial triangulation. And so what is the theory of racial triangulation? And she says, quote, Asian Americans have not been racialized in a vacuum, isolated from other groups. To the contrary, Asian Americans have been racialized relative to and through interaction with whites and blacks. As such, the respective racialization trajectories of these groups are profoundly interrelated, end quote. So I also understood that the standard viewer of the piece, who would see the work, whether it was in a gallery or at a film festival, would be occupying the space of, a heterosexual white male. And in that, I'm also evoking the work of feminist film theorist Laura Mulvey, where she states that as film viewers, we're always sort of in that position of looking at work from that position of a straight white male. And what I found to be also quite telling and perhaps something that I was trying to do as a way to empower myself is looking at the two characters or the two actors within the film. There's actually no space within the video for that male gaze. That white male gaze actually comes when the work is shown. So nobody's enacting anything on us within that narrative. So I see that the racial triangulation actually gets completed when I show the work. Someone who's sitting in the audience who may be this position of being the straight white male, and then the two characters on the screen making that triangulation. Okay, and then this is the last video that I did for this particular presentation that I just wanted to show an image of called No Regrets. It's evoking the work of Hollis Frampton, and what I do with these chocolate kisses, this is what they really look like, is I'm burning them. I go through this ritualistic type of action where I burn them on a grill. And I'm using two texts that were quite compelling for me, both of which were written by Mark Twain. The first one is The Awful German Language. I take a very specific part of that text where I'm reading it, I'm voicing it out in the video. And in the second text, I have an actor read that text that's specifically from Huckleberry Finn, where Jim the slave, he decides that he's going to leave his master and to free himself. Okay, and then here's just a little commercial for you all. I'm actually doing a new work that's also related to the Chocolate Kiss Project. I'll be doing an end kissing booth performance at the Torrance Art Museum on the 31st of March, 2018. It's part of CoLab 3, which is a exchange between LA-based spaces and Berlin-based spaces. So if you have time to come out, you'll be able to participate, and you'll be rewarded for participating in the end kissing booth. So thank you very much.
Again, I wanted to thank our panelists for their powerful presentations. I was sitting in the dark, crying. I'm going to wrap up just briefly with some other evocations, and I also want to echo thanks to Chekwa, Tom, and Laura. today. And of course, you for staying around. This is my nap time, but. So in coming up with the panel, I asked the panelists to respond to these two themes, but I want to bring in a few more voices. So just the framework, which is not in the handout, but I want to underline more this idea of imagination. So creative and critically, artists respond to the policing of borders in the global north and the south and the ongoing vestiges of violence. As I said, imagination is not only celebratory, but also opens up political possibilities. It refers to struggles over images and ideology, cultural wars, and to hot and cold wars, both then and now. So I was thinking about Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, and for him, this idea of imagined community is one that transgresses or questions space and time, that it can be through mass media, through YouTube videos, that if I am with I have family in Vietnam, that I feel connected to them through this imaginative cultural link, right? And that we share YouTube videos or Paris by Night videos. But then, of course, this framing erases some of the kind of political and social political disparities. But I also wanted to evoke this idea of imagination, of course, John Lennon's imagination, but most particularly Daniel J. Martinez's piece in the '93 Whitney Biennial, I Can't Imagine Ever Wanting to Be White, which of course provoked a lot of controversy. And I know that, Kiara, you were talking about identity politics in your class. And of course, the other artists that were responding to literally the kind of white cue, metaphorically and literally, right, that they wrote open letters. Glenn Ligon, of course, and Byron Kim. And you can see, responses, of course, lines around the block. But I also want to think about imagination as Claudia Rankine wrote about it in her book, Citizen. And this is, I guess you perhaps have been seeing a lot of this particular session, segment, poetry fragment on social media. And this is in memory of racialized lives that were violently taken away. And this quote, which I said that was been circulating on social media, because white men can't police their imagination, black men are dying. And for me, I think of whiteness not necessarily as skin color, but I think of it as a sort of metaphor for privilege as well, because certain groups, historically, the 1900s, Mexicans were racialized as Caucasian, technically South Asians are Caucasian, etc. Irish Americans were racialized as black. So thinking about, as you were talking about, this racial triangulation and how race functions within the imaginary, right? It's a construct. And I'm just going to play a quick clip from Claudine talking. Oh, I don't know if you can hear this. Oh, shoot. You can't. Can you hear this at all? Oh. Well, this will save us some time, but I'll just talk over it. He's asking about, some of the lives that have been in the news, Eric Garner, and she says that we talk about race only when it becomes a sort of scandal, when there are shootings, let's say school shootings, or shootings of racialized minorities on the street, but we do not think about race or violence when it is on the everyday, which the book Citizen talks about. But how do we get there from talking about these intimacies of interactions to these large kind of headlines, right? To think about our own complicity in these interactions and our intimacies and the everyday. So this interview is on YouTube. You can watch it on your own. But I also want to show you, because I'm partly social scientist, thinking about what does this look, these intimacies, right? Of course, shootings have been on the rise from 2016, about 1,000. And this is a map, right? California is actually quite dotted. And this was last year, 987. And of course, in Kara's class, I mentioned that today it's about 5.6. So we're still on track. And this is what Rankine talks about, because we can't police our imaginations. This is when does, and I mentioned this, I think of him as me as well, this person, Sonny Lay, who was 17, who got shot for walking to a neighbor's house and holding a pencil, right? This imaginary threat, and these individual case statistics that you can look at on the Washington Post. And finally, immigration points to sites both harrowing and hopeful for nations founded on immigration, evoking this bridge called My Back by Cherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa. The U.S. is a nation of migrants, built upon our labor of radical, backbreaking love. We are its backbone. So I just want to do a couple quick shout-outs that also online we have collaborated with the Vermont College of Fine Arts and several other institutions, Center for Art and Thought, that there's video, and I'm just going to show you half a second. Young artists responding to these themes around immigration and imagination, so you can find it online. And then also, what do we think about, again, when we think about race? Because let's say I'm Asian, surprise, that Asian is also a construct, right? Because when you think of, let's say, Said's Orientalism, that Asia also includes Pakistan, Nepal, Iran, India, Bangladesh, right? Myanmar, Cambodia, and also includes Western Asia, Iraq, Israel, Lebanon, right? So this idea of how we imagine and how we construct our identities and our subjectivities. And of course, there's lots of us coming, or still coming. And this is and especially today in our political climate, about the xenophobia of immigrants and migrants and refugees. And just, again, California, since we're here, one of the largest hotspots. And just to give you some more visuals, and again, this racial triangulation, that this was a Harper's periodical cover that at one time, you can see, that Irish were racialized on this scale, black or white, and this kind of treatments and stereotypes around the racial other, but then also representations of kind of the savage, right? And how that changes, and also evoking and thinking about our border anxieties, that this is nothing new, 1924, that Senator Phelan, who was a senator, if you know of the Montalvo Art Residency, beautiful residencies, I've had some friends that go there, and Kelly's the director, but then it was founded on the senator that passed the Anti-Asian Exclusion Act, which barred Asian laborers, Chinese laborers that went and built the railroads, but then also Mexicans, Muslims, that this was law. And these were some of the images, right? We wanted to kick, I think that's me too, before my haircut, us out of the state, and this idea of the threat of the other, right? And the locusts, and of course, again, Eastern Europeans also as threats, the problem solved, right? Uncle Sam is eaten up. And just to think about these longer histories of racialized violence, this is Ken Gonzalez-Day's work, but to think about these lynchings in California, that it affected not only African Americans, but Latinos were lynched, Asian Americans were also lynched, as that it's not accidental, these violences. And just a quick shout out, also commercial, that I'm gonna end on, but to think again about the imagination, this is coming out, it's in print right now, I was hoping to have some hard copies for you, to think about, again, these imagined communities, this is a 5-year project, but how we form our coalitions and the role of creativity and imagination, and thinking through these structural violences that is not accidental, that is sustained and purposeful, and in thinking through incarceration with this morning, that, what are these systems that are in place, and how can we radically and truly imagine otherwise?